Leith Van Onselen, macrobusiness.com.au. I tell you each week, it's where we go for our financial news. He's brilliant, along with the whole team at Macro Business. He's chief economist at the MB Fund and MB Super, and Leith Van Onselen is on the line. Good morning.
G'day, Luke. How are you?
Very well, mate. I hope things are good with you.
Yeah, all good down here.
Outstanding. Down here, Leith talks about the People's Republic of, Victoria. Danistan. So the Trumpster has a big win, and we wonder what this might mean for the Australian economy. And I guess also we should be interested in what will happen to our government. What do you make of that?
Yeah, so it feels like a long time ago now, but on Melbourne Cup Day Tuesday, the Reserve Bank released its latest interest rate decision. And, to put no uncertain terms on it, there was what economists call a hawkish statement, which means that, it was concerned about inflation. They said straight up in their media release, straight at the top, that, quote, underlying inflation is too high. And that's the thing that the Reserve Bank looks at. It's currently running at 3.5% annually, which is about 0.5% above the Reserve Bank, the top of their interest rate target. And they also said in their media, afterwards in their statement of monetary policy, they basically admitted that the Reserve Bank had underappreciated the strength of public spending. So the federal government's, the total public spending across the economy hit a record high in the June quarter. It's basically driven all of the nation's economic growth. It's driven nearly all of the jobs growth in NDIS type jobs, those sorts of things. And the RBA said that basically this is keeping the unemployment rate low, and it's obviously putting upward pressure on demand, etc. And so before the RBA made their call, most economists in the financial markets tipped that we'd have a rate cut in February. And then after this, they put their rate cut out a little bit by a couple of months. But then obviously we had the election of Donald Trump as president. And after that happened, the financial markets then pushed out their first rate cut prediction to July next year. So it went from February at the start of the week to July. And that's obviously after the next federal election, which has to be held before May. Now, that would obviously be a very, very bad outcome for the Albanese government if it came true, because it desperately needs a Reserve Bank to cut interest rates before the May election. Obviously, the rest of the world's cutting interest rates now. A lot of developed countries, the Federal Reserve in the US just cut rates again. And we're basically an outlier now where we're the one country where our underlying inflation's higher than most other places.
Mate, didn't they cut rates in both the UK and the USA this week?
And Canada, Canada not this week, but Canada's done several cuts. New Zealand's done a few cuts in a row, about to do another big one. Pretty much all the other developed countries now are cutting rates, and we're not. And obviously we have this cost of living crisis and all that sort of thing. Now, I will say that I think Trump's election is actually going to be deflationary for the Australian economy.
Now, why do you say that? That's interesting.
Well, yeah. So basically the Trump administration, and we don't really know exactly what he's going to do, but based on what he said, he's going to slap a massive tariff on China, about 60%, and a 20% tariff on other nations. Now, I think we'll probably be excluded from that because we've got the US free trade agreement, but you never know. And what this means is that we're very likely to be dumped with because the US won't be buying as many goods from other countries because of these tariffs. We'll end up getting dumped with a lot of cheaper goods in Australia. And one of the areas where we're likely to see it is, say, electric vehicles from China. They're going to be selling less into the US because of these tariffs, so they'll end up dumping more on the world, which means dumping them onto Australia, which means that we'll probably get lower goods inflation or imported inflation going forward. But none of this is going to arrive before the next election. Trump's not going to be signed in until January.
January 20,
yeah. Yeah. So, and then obviously takes months to change things around, etc. So none of this is going to happen then. And what this election has done is it has increased uncertainty, because we don't really know exactly what he's going to do. And that means also uncertainty for the Reserve Bank. And it just means that the RBA is likely to probably, hold rates for longer than they otherwise would, just to see how the cards fall.
Yeah.
And that's obviously not good for the federal government, because they need the RBA desperately to cut rates before May. So they're kind of running out of time. And the inflation data, the monetary policy decision this week, which was very hawkish and just said straight out of the top, underlying inflation is too high.
Yeah.
Which is basically a shot at the government. Then also said that government spending's, been a lot hotter than they expected, which has kept the unemployment rate lower because of NDIS type jobs, etc. So it's not looking great for the Albanese government on that front.
I was watching Question Time this week, Leith, and Jim Chalmers had a I don't know if a spring in his step is what I want to say here, but he was he didn't miss the opposition. He was scathing in his commentary about Peter Dutton, calling him, amongst other things, arrogant. Anyway, leave that aside. But there was something noticeable about him. He's either rattled or they're now of the view the only way to beat the other mob and stay in power is to just smash them at every opportunity. Now, of course, as long as they do that, they're not talking about their achievements. Now, some might argue, well, they don't have any. But it's a bit like Kamala Harris, who spent all that time trying to tell Americans about Donald Trump. They already knew about him. They didn't need her to repeat the story, but for as long as she was doing that, she wasn't talking about herself. So I find it fascinating. First off, I don't think one interest rate cut does anything for people who are doing it tough and have had the same interest rate for the last year. And the second thing you and I will talk about, which I spoke earlier today to Dennis Shanahan from the Oz, we think is this lived experience. And this is about the per capita recession, which I think you are almost a lone voice on this. Others have joined now the conversation. But this per capita recession, that's where the rubber hits the road. That's a lived experience part, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. So, I mean, whether or not the overall Australian economy is growing doesn't matter if everyone's slice of the pie on average is less. And that's effectively the Australian economy. So obviously we've dodged a technical recession in the last couple of years, like since we've recovered from the pandemic. But that's been because we've been growing the population like a science experiment. And the fact of the matter is, once you exclude that population growth, we've already had the longest per capita recession on record. It's run for 6 consecutive quarters, or 7 of the last 8 quarters. And the Reserve Bank of Australia's Statement of Monetary Policy, which was released this week, actually downgraded Australia's growth forecast going forward. And the Reserve Bank said that in this calendar year, by the end of the year, we'll have 1.5% annual growth. Now, that's less than the population growth, which is going to be about 2%. And what this means, if you go by the RBA's forecast, we're going to have at least 8 consecutive quarters of per capita decline, and probably more like 9 because it'll run into next year sometime. And the worst thing about it, Luke, is the Reserve Bank's forecast of 1.5% growth is actually a lot better than the IMF's latest forecast, which came out a couple of weeks ago, which is 1.2%. The OECD had 1.1% and Deloitte had 1.1%. So it doesn't matter if you look at the RBA or IMF, OECD, Deloitte, this per capita recession is going to drag on for several quarters to go. And according to the RBA's forecast, our recovery from the recession, the per capita recession, is going to be very weak. And that's because Australia's productivity growth absolutely sucks. Like our labour productivity, which is basically the amount of output per worker, has fallen to 2016 levels. It's currently tracking at 2016 levels. It's gone backwards. And that is basically the driver of per capita growth. And it's likely to stay weak, going forward, possibly for decades, because we've had really since the mid-2000s, our productivity growth has fallen quite sharply. And the primary reason why it's fallen, in my view, is because of ramped up population growth. And what this has done, it's led to what's called capital shalling. So what happens is capital shalling, so in very simple terms, if you grow your population faster, then you grow your infrastructure, your business investment and your housing investment, you end up with less capital per worker and you become less productive, you get more congestion, those sorts of things. Now, to put a stylized example on that so people understand what I'm talking about, if you run a cafe and you've got 1 coffee machine to make coffees and 2 staff that work that coffee machine, you can make, say, 100 coffees in an hour. If you double the number of staff to 4 who have to use that 1 coffee machine, you're not going to double the amount of output because they'll have to wait for each other, they'll bump into each other, they'll get in each other's way, etc.
Yeah.
And that's effectively what the Australian economy has done for 20 years. We've grown by 8.5 million people this century, and we haven't had the infrastructure, the business investment, or the housing to back that up. And what that's done is it's basically lowered the nation's productivity. And if you actually, I've done it, I've charted the immigration rate against labour productivity and per capita GDP, and it's inversely related. So when our immigration ramped up in the mid-2000s, our productivity growth and per capita growth collapsed. And an excellent economist named Gerard Minack, who used to be the former chief economist of Morgan Stanley, he now runs his own advisory, put out a report this week on Australia's capital shallowing and productivity performance, and he came up with exactly the same conclusion. He said that our net capital investments fallen to recessionary levels. in aggregate, but at the same time, we've grown our population aggressively, and this has basically led to this sharp capital shallowing and wrecked Australia's productivity. And because the federal government has, the official projections are to run this high immigration program forever, according to the intergenerational report that came out in 2023, we're going to grow by another 13 million people in the next 39 years through immigration, high immigration. We're just going to keep having this capital shallowing problem because, as we've found out, we cannot build enough housing, enough infrastructure, and have enough investment to keep up with the population growth. And all this means is that we're going to forever have this capital shallowing problem and be a low productivity economy until we change track. And this is the reality situation. Unfortunately, economists don't talk about this. There's only a couple. Like, I've been talking about it for years. Jared Minack, he put out a similar report last year. He just did an update this year. There's very few of us who actually talk about this, and I don't know why. I don't know if it's wokeism or whatever, but it seems pretty obvious. If you live in, Brisbane or Sydney, you've noticed that the time it takes to travel anywhere has taken longer in the last 20 years. That's because of this capital shallowing. We're not building the infrastructure to keep up. And as a result, that's less productivity for the economy. And when you extend that across business investment, housing, etc., it just makes you basically a lower productivity economy and ruins living standards. And that's effectively what we've done. Yeah. And economists don't talk about it enough.
You're outstanding, mate. Thank you so much. Talk to you next week.
Yeah, thanks, Luke.
And for all the people that write to me every time I speak to Leith and say he's the best or he should be PM, I don't think we want to wish that upon him. But gosh, he makes so much sense and explains things so well. Leith Van Onselen, macrobusiness.com.au.